Hi there. So let's see how far we can get today with Baron Trump's marvelous underground journey. We're in chapter 2. We'll jump right over there. And we'll begin. According to the learned Don Fum's manuscript, the portals to the world within a world were situated somewhere in northern Russia. Possibly, so he thought, from all indications somewhere on the westerly slope of the upper Urals. But the great thinker could not locate them with any accuracy. "The people will tell thee," was the mysterious phrase that occurred again and again in the mildewed pages of this wonderful writing. "The people will tell thee." But what people will be learned enough to tell me that? Was the brain-racking question which I asked myself, sleeping and waking at sunrise, at high noon and at sunset, at the crowing of the cock, and in the silent hours of the night. "The people will tell thee," said learned Don Fum. But what people will tell me where to find the portals to the world within a world? Hitherto on my travels I had made choice of semi-oriental garb, both on account of its picturesqueness and its lightness and warmth. But now I was about to pass quite across Russia. For a number of months I resolved to don the Russian national costume. For speaking Russian fluently, as I did a score or more of languages, living and dead, I would thus been able to come and go without everlastingly displaying my passport, or having my trains of thought constantly disturbed by inquisitive traveling companions. A very important thing to me, for my mind possessed the extraordinary power of working out automatically any task assigned to it by me, provided it was not suddenly thrown off its track by some ridiculous interruption. For instance, I was upon the very point one day of discovering perpetual motion, when the gracious Baroness suddenly opened the door and asked me whether I had pared the nails of my great toes lately, and she had observed that I had worn holes in several pairs of my best stockings. It was about the middle of February when I set out from the Castle Trump, and I journeyed night and day in order to reach Petersburg by the 1st of March, for I knew that the government trains would leave that city for the White Sea during the first week of that month. Bulger and I were both in the best of health and spirits, and the fatigue of the journey didn't tell upon us in the least. The moment I arrived at the Russian capital, I applied to the Emperor for permission to join one of the government trains, which was most graciously accorded. Our route lay almost directly northward for several days, at the end of which time we reached the shores of Lake Ladoga. This we crossed on the ice with our sledges, as a few days later we did Lake Onega. Thence by land again, when we kept our way until Onega Bay had been reached, crossing it too on the ice, and so reaching the station of the same name, where we halted for a day to give our horses a well-deserved rest. From this point we proceeded in a straight line over the snowfields to Archangel, an important trading post on the White Sea. As this was the destination of the government train, I parted with its commandant after a few days' pleasant sojourn at the government house, and set out, attended only by my faithful Bulger and 2 servants, who had been assigned to me by the Imperial Commissioner. And there's the picture of him leaving the house. Departure from Castle Trump. Looks like somebody drew all these with pencil. It's amazing. Okay. My course now carried me up the river Dwina as far as Slavodogorsk. Yeah, right. Thence I proceeded on my way over the frozen waters of the Wachegda River until we had reached the government post of Yarnetsk. And from here on we headed due east until our hardy little horses had dragged us into the picturesque valley of Ilich on the Ilich. Here we were obliged to abandon our sledges, for the snows had disappeared like magic, uncovering long vistas of green fields, which in a few days the May sun dotted with flowers and sweet shrubs. At Ilich I was obliged to relinquish from my service the 2 faithful government retainers who had accompanied me from Archangel, for they had now reached the most westerly point which they had been commissioned to visit. I had become very much attached to them, so had Bulger, and after their departure we both felt as if we were now for the first time among strangers in a strange land. But I succeeded in engaging, as I thought, a trustworthy teamster, Ivan by name, who made a contract with me for a goodly wage to carry me 100 miles farther north. But not another step further, little baron, said the fellow doggedly. I was now really at the foothills of the northern Urals, for the rocky crests and snow-clad peaks were in full sight. I turned away a wistful look up towards a wild region shut in by their sheer walls and parapets, shaggy and bristling with black pines, for a low mysterious voice came a-whispering in my inward ear that somewhere in that awful wilderness I should one day come upon the portals of the world within a world. In spite of all I could do, Bulger took a violent dislike to Ivan and Ivan to him, and if the bargain had not been made and the money paid over, I should have looked about me for another teamster. And yet it would have been a foolish thing to do, for Ivan had 2 excellent horses, and I saw at a glance, and what's more, he took the best care of them, at every post rubbing them until they were quite dry, and never thinking of his own supper until they had been watered and fed. His tarantass, too, was quite new and solidly built and well furnished with soft blankets. All in all, as comfortable as you can make a wagon, which has no other springs than the 2 long wooden supports that reach from axle to axle. True, they were somewhat elastic, but I could notice that Bulger was not over fond of riding in this curious vehicle, with its rattly banged gait up and down these mountain roads, and often asked permission to leap out and follow on foot. At length Ivan reported everything in readiness for the start, and although I would have fain taken my departure from Illich on the Illich in as quiet a manner as possible, yet the whole village turned out to see us off. Ivan's family, father, mothers, sisters and brothers, wife and children, uncles and aunts and cousins by dozens alone, making up people enough to stock a small town. They cheered and waved their kerchiefs. Bulger barked, and I smiled and raised my cap with all the dignity of a trump. And so we got away at last from Illich on the Illich, Ivan on the box, and Bulger and I at the back, sitting close together like 2 brothers that we were. 2 breasts with but a single heartbeat, and 2 brains busy with the same thought. That come perils or come sudden attacks, come covert danger, bold or open-faced onslaught, we should stand together and fall together. Many and many times, as Ivan's horses went crawling up the long stretches of mountain road, I lay stretched upon the broad cushioned seat of the tarantass, with a blanket rolled up for a pillow. I would find myself unconsciously repeating the mysterious words of Don Fum. The people will tell thee, the people will tell thee. So steep were the roads that some days we would not make more than 5 miles. On others, a halt of several hours would have to be made to enable Ivan to tighten his horse's shoes and grease the axles or do some needful thing in or about his wagon. It was slow work. It was very slow and tedious. But what matters is how many or great the difficulties to a man who has made up his mind to accomplish a certain task. Do the storks or the wild geese stop to count the thousands of miles between them and their faraway homes when the time comes to turn their heads southward? Do the brown ants pause to count the hundreds of thousands of grains of sand which they must carry through their long corridors and winding passages before they have burrowed deep enough to escape the frost of midwinter? There had been many trumps, but never one that had thrown up his arms and cried, "I surrender." That's I'll leave that alone. And should I be the first to do it? Never. Not even if it meant never to see dear old Castle Trump again. One morning, as we went zigzagging up a particularly nasty bit of mountain road, Ivan suddenly wheeled about, and without even taking off his hat, cried out, "Little Baron, I cover the last mile of the 100 today. If thou wouldst go any further north, thou must hire thee another teamster. Dost hear?" "Silence," I said sternly, for the fellow had broken upon a very important train of thought. Bulger, too, resented the man's insolence and growled and showed his teeth. "But, little Baron, listen to reason," he continued in a more respectful tone, removing his cap. "My people will expect me back. I promised my father. I'm a dutiful son. Nay, Ivan," I interrupted sharply. "Curb that tongue of thine, lest it harm thy soul. Know, then, that I spoke with thy father, and he promised me that thou shouldst go a second 100 miles with me if need were, but on condition that I gave thee double pay. It shall be done. And on top of that, a goodly present for your Glabuchka, darling." "Little Baron, thou art a hard master," whimpered the man. "If the whim took thee, thou wouldst bid me leap into the giant's well just to see whether it has a bottom or not. St. Nicholas save me." "Nay, Ivan," I said kindly, I I know no such word as cruelty, although I do confess that right seems harsh at times. But thou wert born to serve, and I to command. Providence hath made thee poor and me rich. We need each other. Do thou thy duty, and thou wilt find me just as considerate. Disobey me, and thou wilt find me short. This short arm may be stretched from Illich to Petersburg. Ivan turned pale at this hidden threat of mine, but I deemed it necessary to make it, for I, as well as Bulger, had scented treachery and rebellion about this boorish fellow, whose good trait was his love of his horse, and it was always been my rule in life to open my eyes wide to the good that there is in a man, and close them to his faults. But in spite of kind words and kind treatment, Ivan grew surlier and moodier the moment we had passed the 100th milestone. Bulger watched him with a gaze so steady and thoughtful that the man fairly quailed over it. Hour by hour he became more and more restive, and upon leaving a roadside tavern for the very first time since we had left Illich on the Illich, I noticed that the fellow had been drinking too much kvass. He let loose his tongue and raised his hand against his horses, which until that moment had been wont to load down with caresses and pet names. "Look out for that driver of thine, little baron," whispered the tavern-keeper. He's in a reckless mood. He'd not pull up if the giant's well were gaping in front of him. St. Nicholas have thee in his safe keeping. Okay, I think we can do another chapter. Chapter 3. When we halted for the night, it was only by threatening the man with severe punishment upon my return to Illich that I could bring him to rub his horses dry and feed and water them properly. But I stood over him until he had done his work thoroughly, for I knew that no such horses could be had for love of money in that country, and if they should go lame from standing with wet coats in the chill night air, it meant a week's delay. Scarcely had I thrown myself on the hard mattress which the tavern-keeper called the best bed in the house, when I was aroused by a loud and boisterous talking in the next room. Ivan was drinking and quarreling with the villagers. I strode into the room with the arrows of indignation shooting from my eyes, and the faithful Bulger close at my heels. The moment Ivan set eyes upon us, he shrank away, half in earnest, half in jest, and called out, "Hey, look, it's the little dandy." I'm not going to try and pronounce that word. "How smart he looks. He frightens me. See his eyes, how they shine in the dark. Look at the little demon on 4 legs beside him. Save me, brother, save me. He will throw me down into the giant's well. Maryanka will never see me again. Never, never. Save me, brothers." "Peace, fellow," I called out sternly. "How darest thou exercise thy dull wit on thy master? Get thee to bed at once, or I'll have thee whipped in the village constable for thy drunkenness." Ivan clambered up upon the top of the bake-oven and stretched himself out on a sheepskin. Then, turning to the tavern-keeper, I forbade him under any pretext whatever to give my servant any more liquor to drink. Your Excellency," he exclaimed, the tavern-keeper with a gesture of disgust. "The fools never know when they have had enough. It matters not what the tavern-keeper may say to them. They tell us not to spoil our own trade. They don't know when to stop. They have throats as deep as the giant's well." The giant's well, I murmured to myself, as I again threw myself down upon the bag of hay which did service as a mattress for those who could afford to pay for it. It's strange how those words seem to be in every peasant's mouth. But I thought no more about it at that time. Sleep got the better of me, and with my usual good night to the elder baron and the gracious baroness, my mother, I dropped off into sweet forgetfulness. It is a good thing that I had the power of falling asleep almost at will, for with my restless brain ever throbbing and pulsating with its own overabundance of strength, ever tapping at the thin panels of bone which covered it, like an imprisoned inmate pounding on his cell door and pleading to be let out into the daylight with his plans and schemes, I would simply have become a lunatic. As it was, with the mere power of thought, I ordered sweet slumber to come to my rescue, and so obedient was the good angel of mine that all I had to do was simply to set the time when I wished to awaken, and the thing was done to the very minute. As for Bulger, I never pretended to lay down any rules for him. He made it a practice of catching 40 winks when he was persuaded that no danger of any kind threatened me, and even then, I'm half inclined to believe that, like an anxious mother over her babe, he never quite closed both eyes at once. Though entirely sobered at daybreak, yet Ivan went about the task of harnessing up with such ill grace that I was obliged to reprove him several times before he had left the tavern yard. He was like a vicious but cowardly animal that quails before a strong and steady eye, but watches its opportunity to bring upon you when your back is turned. I not only called Bulger's attention to the fellow's actions, and warned him to be very watchful, but I also took the precaution to examine the priming of the brace of Spanish pistols which I carried thrust in my belt. We had scarcely pulled out into the highway when a low growl from Bulger aroused me from a fit of meditation, and this growl was followed by such an anxious whine from my four-footed brother as he raised his eyes speaking to me, that I glanced hastily from one side of the road to the other. Lo and behold, the treacherous Ivan was deliberately engaged in an attempt to overturn the tarantass and to get rid of his enforced task transporting us any further on our journey. "Wretch!" I cried, springing up and laying my hand on his shoulder. "I perceive very plainly what thou hast in mind. But I warn thee most solemnly that if thou makest another attempt to overturn thy wagon, I will slay thee where thou sittest." Wow. Kill you where you sit. For only answer, and with lightning-like quickness, he struck a backhand blow at me with the loaded end of his whipstock. It took me full in the right temple and sent me to the bottom of the tarantass like a piece of lead. For an instant the terrible blow robbed me of my senses. But then I saw that the cowardly villain had turned in his seat and swung the heavy-handed whip aloft with intent to dispatch me with a second and surer blow. Poor fool, he reckoned without his host, for with a shriek of rage Bulger leaped at his throat like a stone from a catapult and struck his teeth deep into the fellow's flesh. He roared with agony and attempted to shake off his unexpected foe, but in vain. By this time I had come to a full realizing sense of the terrible danger Bulger and I were both in, for Ivan had dropped his whip and was reaching for his sheath knife, but he never gripped it, for a well-aimed shot from one of my pistols struck him in the forearm, for I had no wish to take the man's life, and broke it. The shock and the pain so paralyzed him that he fell over against the dashboard, half in a faint, and then rolled completely out of the wagon, dragging Bulger with him. The horses now began to rear and plunge. I saw no more. There was a noise as of the roar of angry waters in my ears, and then the light of life went out of my eyes entirely. I had swooned dead away. It seemed to me hours that I lay there on my back in the bottom of the tarantass with my head hanging over the side, but of course it was only minutes. I was aroused by a prickling sensation on my left cheek, and as I slowly came to myself, I discovered that it proceeded from the gravel thrown up against it by one of the front wheels of the tarantass, for the horses were galloping along at the top of their speed, and there on the driver's seat sat my faithful Bulger, reins in his teeth, bracing himself as to keep them taut over the horses' backs. And as I sat up and pressed my hand against my poor hurt head, the whole truth broke upon me. The moment Ivan had struck the ground, Bulger had released his hold upon the fellow's throat, and ere he had had a chance to revive, and leaped upon the driver's seat, and catching up the reins in his teeth, had drawn them taut, and thus put an end to the rearing and plunging of the frightened beast, and started them on their way, leaving the enraged Ivan brandishing his knife and uttering impressions upon mine and Bulger's heads as he saw his horses and wagon disappear in the distance. Now was it that a mad shouting assailed my ears, and I caught a glimpse of half a dozen peasants who, seeing this, as they thought, empty tarantass come nearer and nearer with its galloping horses, had abandoned their work and rushed out to intercept it. Judge of their amazement, dear friends, as their eyes fell upon the calm and skilful driver bracing himself on the front seat, and with oft-repeated backward tosses of his head, urging those horses to bear his beloved master further and further away from the treacherous Ivan's sheath knife. As the peasants seized the animals by the heads and brought them to a standstill, I staggered to my feet and threw my arms around my dear Bulger. He was more than pleased with what he had done, and licked my bruised brow with many a piteous moan. "Saint Nicholas save us!" cried one of the peasants devoutly, making a sign of the cross. "But if I should live long enough to fill the giant's well with pebbles, I never expected to see the like of this again." The giant's well, I murmured to myself as I followed one of the peasants to his cot, standing a little back of the highway, for I stood sore in need of rest after the terrible experience I had just had. The blow of Ivan's whip handle had jarred my brain, and I was skilled enough in surgery to know that the hurt called for immediate attention, As good luck would have it, I found beneath the peasant's roof one of those old women, half-witches perhaps, who have recipes for everything and who know an herb for every ailment. After she had examined the cut made by the loaded whip handle, she muttered out, "It's not as broad as the mountain, nor as deep as the giant's well, but it's bad enough, little master." The giant's well again, thought I, as I laid me down on the best bed they could make up for me. I wonder where it may be, the giant's well, and how deep it is, and who drinks the water that is drawn from it. So, that is chapter 2 and 3. We'll stop at chapter 4. It's getting pretty interesting, huh? Yeah. We'll leave it there. And I may do another 2 chapters later on today. This is getting kind of exciting, I don't want to stop, but keep up. And these will all be in the Storytime playlist. If you miss any, you could go back and look up the playlist and get them. But until next time, keep thinking about little Baron Trump. See ya.